Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the International House. I'm Professor Eefje Hendriks, and I'm Director of the Institute of Advanced Studies here at Loughborough University. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, despite it being mid-August when we think that everyone is resting. Clearly not. Hopefully you've had the chance to rest, though, or will have a chance to rest. We're absolutely excited to host our residential fellow, last fellow of the 2024-2025 academic year, Dr. Eefje Hendriks. It's wonderful to have you here. It's been great kind of seeing you around over the last few weeks. I've known Eefje for quite a few years now. I don't know how many years, but I think the first time I've heard of her work was through the special issue that Eefje and colleagues, 3 other early career researchers, published in Disaster Prevention and Management journal. And it wasn't your normal kind of special issue that we academics are used to. These guys, 4 of them, they published this as a collective. They didn't use their individual names to claim the special issue. They worked as a collective, and they really gave voices to the early career researchers who are focusing on disaster studies. I know that some of colleagues in Loughborough published in that special issue, and it's just been really fantastic to see early career researchers taking the lead in the kind of disaster scholarship that we want to see. So thank you for doing that. And then, of course, since then, Eefje's career has kind of progressed, and it's been wonderful to see that as well, and to be part of that to some extent. So I'm absolutely delighted that you're here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Xenia, for the warm welcome and also for hosting me here. I've been really enjoying exploring the place where you guys work and the surroundings. So it's been really wonderful, and also meeting colleagues here to discuss new ideas and new potential collaborations. So my name is Eefje Hendriks, and today I'll be talking about rebuilding lives and understanding decision-making processes understanding also the impact of post-disaster housing assistance. So how can we help people? I have different parts of my work, and I'm based in the Center for Disaster Resilience that we have in the University of Twente, and I host the Build Back Safer lab. So we have a lab where we discuss these topics at a wider scale. And I look at behavioral patterns during post-disaster reconstruction, decision-making, effective assistance. How can we help people find ways to really find effective assistance? But also I look at climate change adaptation, circularity and sustainability of housing, and also all different kinds of interdisciplinary collaboration. So that's also why I really like being here and talking with people from different disciplines, from psychology, from arts, from politics, from all different directions. So that's really enjoyable so far. So we'll be talking about houses. Okay, nice. But let's talk first about your own house. So I would like to invite you to discuss with your neighbor something, simple things. First of all, what makes you proud about your own house? Where would you wish to live? Maybe Porto Alegre or somewhere else. What do you really hate about your house? What are you loyal to? What would you never change about your house? And what would you do if you would have a tiny bit of money? What would be the first thing you would do? So I invite you please to discuss with your neighbor something about your own house in 2 minutes. Okay, can I'm sorry to interrupt the conversation. I see this sparks many wonderful conversations talking about your house. I see a lot of smiles, a lot of new ideas popping up. Expensive furniture as you for investment. What was something that you discovered here?
I hate to clean.
You hate to clean.
Pros and cons.
Pros and cons. Yeah.
Every house, I think.
Every house, yes.
It's a bit hot in our country actually, so we hate the air circulation because it's hot.
Yeah, the heat is can be really a problem. Well, let's imagine you would lose your house overnight and you have to start over. That's the topic we're discussing today. What if a disaster happens? And this is not something unique. This is something that happens to many people. So 167 million people are yearly affected by natural hazards. That's a huge number, and 40 million people become homeless because of it. We see that many people get killed. 40 to 60,000 people are killed yearly. And a lot of that is because of poor housing. So approximately 90% of the damage is related, or is in low-income countries, and most of the damage is related to housing, so failing housing, 70% approximately. So what we see is that a safe house or a hazard-resistant house, maybe even to extreme heat, a hazard-resistant house is very important for many people. How do you get to that? And when we talk about hazard resistance, well, maybe you have been to the IKEA once before, but you have these kind of IKEA sort of manuals to help you build a hurricane-resistant house or earthquake-resistant, but also flood-resistant. So there's different ways that you can find, build a safer house. You might be able to understand these IKEA step kind of manuals, but it's not for everybody so easy. And especially when you get many disasters at the same time. For example, in Indonesia here, our guest here in the front, you have many disasters. It's not just the heat that you're dealing with, right?
Because our country is situated in a ring of fire, so.
The ring of fire, yeah. So it's not only heat, it's also hurricanes, and there are tsunami risks, there are volcanoes. So there are multiple hazards that people have to build for. So can I see some people standing up if you think you will be affected by a disaster in the next 5 years? Do you think you will be affected by a natural disaster or a natural hazard in the next 5 years? Nobody stands up. Okay, you're all staying
Yes.
seated. If you think yes, you can stand up. Okay. Verleggen Brazil, yeah, that is definitely a possibility. Well, these risks might be a little bit difficult to understand sometimes, right? If we look at the map of the Netherlands here, just across the pond, we see that approximately 60% of our country is at risk of being flooded. It's huge, but is it really going to affect me? That's something we all have doubts about, and to realize that also. My house is here, very safe and dry, and my university is there, also very safe and dry. So am I going to be affected? Maybe not, but the country might be. So what we see in a larger scale, we see an increased frequency of climate-related hazards. We see the hazards, the disaster situations are becoming more complex. So risks are overlapping, there are multiple hazards, there are cascading hazards, there also are health impacts. So the situations are becoming more complex to deal with. We see also an increasing impact of hazards on people and assets, and more people are on the move because of natural hazards. But all this is also affected by decreased funding. So we have more people at risk, but less funding to battle those risks. As we just discussed, there are places in the world that are have way more hazards to deal with. And indeed, when you look at the hazards happening today, well, actually yesterday, we see that there are many disaster situations unfolding around the world that we might not even have heard of. They are not in the news, and they might not receive the attention that other situations get. So when is something really a disaster? Any ideas? Not asking disaster experts in the room, but any ideas? When is it really a disaster?
Loss of life.
Loss of life? Property?
I was about to say that anything, a hazard which is going to cause loss for big property or life or whatever, it becomes a disaster.
Environmental losses.
Environmental losses?
Health issues.
So there is a definition that we use to explain what a disaster is. And we say that, okay, there is a certain vulnerability to a certain risk. You can imagine there's a large vulnerability in Indonesia to certain risk. There is a high exposure to a risk, for example, a flood, a hurricane, but you don't have the capacity to deal with it. So then it becomes maybe a loss that you cannot recover from. And then it becomes a disaster. Because if you lose your shed in the garden and you build a new one, is it really a disaster? So it is really about, okay, do we have the capacity to bounce back and or actually bounce forward and get to a better situation after? So then we call it a disaster if it's difficult to cope with. So we don't call these disasters natural, because they're not natural. They're only a disaster when we are not prepared to deal with it. Then we are not prepared to deal with the hazards that is impacting us. And if that is the case, and if a country also is not able to deal with the hazard impact, then there is often an international call for humanitarian aid. Only when the country also says, well, even within the country level, we have difficulty dealing with this situation. So then outsiders sometimes come in. International humanitarian organizations, often based with their headquarters in Europe or in the US. So they come in and they look at situations that are maybe not their own. So let's see what they see. So when we see a situation like this, what do we see? What do you see here happening?
Reconstruction.
Reconstruction, yes. What else do we see in this situation?
Reckless worker.
Sorry?
Reckless worker.
Reckless worker. Okay, yeah, maybe. Yeah. Dangerous, you see.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would actually say teamwork.
Teamwork, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's the mountains.
You see the mountains, yes. And what would that mean for this process?
I think these people I don't know what is this site, but it seems like they are building a house in an exposed area, probably.
Yeah, we have a landslide expert here in France, so you can imagine, yeah, it might be a difficult area also to build in. What do we see here?
Vulnerable house.
Vulnerable house, yeah, you can indeed see some cracks here still.
Comment on one says inaccessibility.
Inaccessibility, yeah. Access to, for example, materials, to resources, can be very tricky when you're so high up in the mountain. Other things we see?
Still, there used to be a house there, maybe.
You mean there's like different houses already there?
Seems as if maybe there has been a house that was destroyed.
Yeah, indeed, the damaged house, the temporary house, and now the reconstructed house. So indeed, you see there's a process going on. There's different phases in that reconstruction process. Yeah, good notice. What do we see here?
There's a couple of comments. Locally available materials and community participation.
Yeah, community participation, locally available materials. You can imagine that the materials that you can build with, should be in a reasonable distance from the house you're working with. Okay, so you can see it's quite difficult, right? We go to a situation we don't know, and it's difficult to judge what we see and how we can best help the people in this process. So, we're trying to find out, okay, would you be able to build back a safer house? Would they be able to build back a safer house? And what are their main struggles? How can we help them build back safer? So that is sometimes difficult to understand. So we need to know a little bit more about post-disaster reconstruction, that whole process. When we look at everybody who's affected by natural hazards, this is a disgusted number, but it gives an indication of how big the amount of people is who have to do it all by themselves. Approximately 80 to 90% has to do it fully without assistance to reconstruct. So no governmental and no humanitarian assistance. So just on their own, almost everybody. And we see that this number will even grow further because we see that already in 2024, there was a huge lack of humanitarian funding. You see that this is the gap in humanitarian funding. And we see it's a prediction that will go up also because of the budget cuts in US aid. You can imagine this problem will become bigger and bigger. So these kind of manuals, well, maybe if they're happy to find it, but it's still difficult for them to apply or find the materials, find the resources to get that process started. I come from architecture, and sometimes as architects, we think, wow, we can just build this amazing shelter, we drop it, and then it will be the amazing solution for everybody. But you can imagine, like also seeing the recent drops maybe, for example, in Gaza, that just dropping a solution is not always the right solution for everyone, right? Because what would be the problem if you just drop these kind of shelters from the air?
Allocation to the people who gets what is not decided, so people come up in large numbers together.
Yeah, who's going to fight for this solution?
Yeah, they fight normally for food. Normally this happens when they have food airlifted and then dropped.
Yeah, so it's important to understand who are the most vulnerable people that we are going to help. What other problems do we see here?
This one needs flat ground.
Needs flat ground. Yeah, that's not always the case, right? So the world in the Netherlands is very flat, but in other places of the world, it's not the case.
Expertise needed,
Expertise, yeah, for what?
the construction.
Yeah, so this design is like this pop-up tent, but yeah, indeed, you might have to need also some expertise. So these kind of designs coming from architecture, we love to make amazing designs that are fit for any purpose. But there is no shelter is not a product that we can just make. We say sheltering is a process. So it is also an incremental process. We already saw it in those 3 houses, right? So it's a process that people are in. And maybe in the first phase, there are certain needs, but over a longer time, we need, for example, good climate, indoor climate to work with, and we have more needs. So this is an incremental process. So we have to take also into account that those priorities change over time. So in that process, there's different ways and different steps in the process where there might be a need for assistance, but there also might be not a need for assistance, right? Some people can do it by themselves. So there's different types of support. So we already discussed material access, or financial access, or access to technologies, to skills, to understanding how to build a house. But it also is some types of different indirect support. For example, strengthening the local construction a material market, or making sure there is actually manpower available. But what we also see here, there is not a one-size-fits-all. So if a disaster happens in Indonesia or in Porto Alegre, a different type of disaster, different people, different culture, we cannot just copy-paste and go there with the one-size-fits-all solution. So we have to find ways to adapt the way we give aid. In general, what we see, there's many gaps. Also because of funding, limited funding. We see there's a lot of unsafe reconstruction. People often build back the same thing in the same way as they've done before a disaster. It's just what we know, and we are likely to go back to something we know. We also see it in the Netherlands, right, where we have access to all kinds of information in the flood-affected areas. We build back the same houses in a flood-affected area. We see a lot of inadequate communication tools that is very one-way directed, and also using icons that are maybe not always locally understood or even found by people that need those. We see there is also an unclear impact of all those interactions. So we do a lot of things, but what is really the impact on people's lives on the long term, especially? We sometimes ask people, okay, do you like what I just gave you? Okay, yes, thanks, check the box. But it doesn't mean that we have a good understanding what is there on the long term. Very limited research, and limited understanding of this overall decision making, especially of this large group that is left without assistance. Because sometimes humanitarian organizations reflect on their own practice, but not on the wider situations. So we see that the reconstruction assistance is insufficiently adapted to all these types of personal situations. So there's really a need to rethink the assistance that we give and how it is designed. So it's about matchmaking. So the question that drives me is which, how, and when is recovery assistance effective to enhance the housing and settlement resilience of people affected? So I do this in different steps. I look at understanding the system of reconstruction decisions. So how do people already make the decisions? What are their main barriers and drivers there? And how can we adapt assistance to those reconstruction decisions that are already happening for different types of disasters? And what is the impact then maybe on their resilience? So these two challenges drive me. So I'm looking at really understanding the situation of affected household and finding also quick and rapid ways to do that matchmaking, to adapt the way we give aid to the decision-making process. That's a challenge because as researchers, sometimes we analyze data, we take a long time, but we need to have a solution also on within the timeline of the people affected. So this also requires a holistic understanding of reconstruction decision-making. I'm an architect, I have a technical background, but luckily there's also other people involved in the sector that have other types of expertise like psychology that we also need in this field. Because reconstruction decision-making touches many fields of expertise. Psychology, sociology, communication science, construction techniques, disaster science. So we need a little bit of everything to really understand how people make decisions. So that is also the core of my work. I try to understand decision making. So we can look at the individual, but we can also look at the individual as part of a social system, or the individual as part of their environment, how they make decisions. And these interactions are core to analyze there. When you think about decision making, well, maybe are people aware of the risks? Often they are. When you are dealing with landslides, you sort of know you are in a risky area. What are the needs that people have? Do they have certain knowledge needs or needs for manpower or other kinds of needs? What is their perception of the risk? Is it just a risk that you accept, or are there different ways to understand the risk you're dealing with? What kind of networks do people already have? We already mentioned teamwork. Well, you can see indeed what kind of networks do they have to other people to help them, support them in the reconstruction of their house. And what kind of barriers and drivers? Well, we already discussed access might be a difficult thing here, access to materials. And eventually, does this lead to safety of the house or resilience as a whole? They might have a very safe house, but as already highlighted, it might be a very risky location. So what is the overall safety of the people? We need to understand all these aspects to better personalize the assistance that we give. And identify different pathways to get from this holistic understanding to designing effective assistance. And as I already told you, I have a study background. You all have your own study background. So what we do is we try to find other ways of accessing that knowledge. We know that there's big gaps in science because what we see in the literature is what we call weird. It's Western, from an educated world, it's industrialized, rich and democratic. So there's a big gap in the types of voices that we see in the literature represented. So one of the ways that we do is we try to use action research and participatory research to find better pathways towards resilience with local stakeholders that are really expert on the topic and facilitating those conversations. And another way that we try to better understand the decision making is through data collection. And I primarily look at people that are doing it all by themselves. So, as you might know, in the Philippines is yearly affected by hurricanes, and they often land on the east of the country, but not so often in the west. So I look to communities that are not often affected by hurricanes, and to understand how they deal with the reconstruction process. The same in Nepal. I compare the Gorkha earthquake. Maybe you remember it was a really big earthquake in Nepal, and there was a lot of humanitarian assistance going to one area and very little assistance going to another affected area. What are the differences? And last year I went to Nepal to look at Banka and Dang, two districts that are often flood affected. How are people dealing with this recurring risk that they have, but also the earthquake risks that are also present there. So they are dealing with more with a multi-hazard risk scenario. So there's different insights that I can share with you about post-disaster reconstruction decision making. Some of them might not really surprise you, but it's good to show them. So let's talk about safety of the houses. Well, this one is maybe the most surprising. What we saw is that with a lot of humanitarian assistance, we see that it actually did not really increase the safety of the houses. So the district that receives a lot of humanitarian assistance and the one without humanitarian assistance actually had safer houses, slightly, but still. So it gives some reason to rethink the way assistance is designed and what kind of impact it has. We see also the new designs. So these were the designs before the earthquake. These were designs after the earthquake, stimulated by the government. There was a low satisfaction, and that can be problematic on the long term. You can imagine that people add a room on the side, on top, and slowly this can impact the safety of the house. And we can also see that what we see today, so the assessment that we did is a moment in time. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they will also use it in the future. So the district that did actually quite a good job in reconstructing their house, they are not so eager to rebuild in the same way in the future, while the one with humanitarian assistance was more likely to rebuild in the same way in the future. So what we see now is no guarantee for the future. It's also good to understand those differences. We also see that the timeline of assistance sometimes does not really match the timeline of the people. For example, this is a man I visited. He reconstructed his house in Nepal, and you might not know a lot about earthquakes, but he asked me, "Oh, is this house safe?" And earthquake resistant building is like a wrap in a. I always explain it as a gift package with a lot of ropes around it. You need those bands, continuous bands around the building to make it a safe package that can shake and avoids to break. So in this case, it's difficult for him because it's very difficult to make his house safer when it's already finished. Also, the barriers and drivers are different in every case, but there are some things that we see that after a disaster, you can imagine you have lost everything. People are very motivated to build back a safe house. So in most cases, we don't have to come in and to motivate people to build back a safer house. So there's also other aspects that motivate them, but I think that's an important one to know. The earthquake itself or the hazard itself really motivates people. You don't want to experience this twice. We also see that many of the barriers that people experience are not really related to technology. So I also don't really have to come in and teach people how to build. We see that the most barriers are financial. So how do I get all the resources, all the funding together to build a safer house? That is the main struggle, especially if you're dependent on agriculture and really exchanging goods on a daily basis or dependent on your own field. Safety perceptions. We also see that a safe house is not always a priority. You can imagine maybe when you were talking about your own house, maybe many of you did not really consider the safety at all. Maybe it was also not very relevant in the UK, but safety is not always a priority. There's many other aspects that people struggle with on a daily basis. We looked at different types of recovery assistance and also to look at what makes people feel safer. Well, we saw also that some of the types of assistance that were given actually made people feel more unsafe. So you can imagine the more you know about the disaster, the more you know how you're failing to reconstruct your house, maybe in a safe way, the more unsafe you might feel at night when you are sleeping there. So it's not always good to know all the risks you're facing, right? You can imagine this maybe from the Corona times. What makes you sleep well is not always being aware of all the risks. We also saw that there is sometimes a need for a combination of assistance. So only giving people material or only giving people financial aid is not necessarily helping them towards safety, but sometimes it's a combination. So giving people both training and funding can really stimulate the impact on the safety. This is something I've personally found very interesting, is that the the way humanitarian aid impacts local networks. So the districts that got a lot of humanitarian assistance, we see here, there's quite a spread in the way people trust others. So we see a lot of family connections, local engineers, community members. So we see that the network is quite spread, the knowledge is spread without the communities. While we saw, for example, in the district that were only like temporarily assigned young engineers, that these young engineers were meant to go way back to the capital and take that knowledge with them. So this dependence is a little bit more problematic on the long term. So this kind of knowledge we also saw, as you might already imagined, it does not reach everyone. But we saw also a lot of potential that people find their way to knowledge and they find access to knowledge. For example, through community meetings, radio, demonstration houses, door-to-door assistance. So there's other ways that people find knowledge without documentation. So these kind of experts that make these architects that make these amazing manuals, it's not always needed. People find their ways as well. This is something that very much aligns with the work of Xenia as well. She also found the same findings. Well, community-based construction workers are really important to engage. Those are the most trusted. So I guess the psychologists here in the room might depend on those local construction workers to make decisions for them. Logical, also maybe something we would have expected, but these are crucial to engage also in the learning process. And this I already discussed. So, okay, we know all this. There's much more to know. These are just some few highlights of how to understand the decision making. Okay, but now, how do we effectively engage with them? How do we, how can the type of assistance we give be personalized to the people and understanding those barriers? So we take here a view from psychology, so feel free to criticize me, George, if it's not correct. Well, we look at motivation, ability, and opportunity. And we see when people have a high motivation, a high ability, and a high opportunity, it is increasing the likelihood of behavior. And this is something that's often used in social studies and also in marketing to sell you a banana in the supermarket. They use the same sort of mechanisms. So we can assess that also in practice and also help to understand what are the characteristics of people when they reconstruct, group them, and also position the way we give aid. So how does this look? So for example, if you have a low motivation, a low ability, low opportunity, you end up in a different cluster than someone with a very high ability, high motivation, and high opportunity. So we can see that there's different groups appearing in the reconstruction process. So this is just to give you an example of the community reconstructing all by themselves after the earthquake in Gorka. And we see that specific groups are more present than others. So for example, we see this group and this group more present than others. And we found, okay, there's opportunities for these groups to learn from each other. They were often present within the same communities, and there was really an opportunity to connect those groups. So we looked at the characteristics. I will not go into detail too much, but we have, of course, published that. And we said, okay, there are some things that really need to come from the outside. So maybe at a community level, because we see there's a gap within the whole community. But there's definitely opportunity for peer-to-peer learning on other aspects. And then some aspects they maybe cannot learn from each other. That is maybe where personalized assistance can come in. So this is just an example of understanding these two groups and trying to find a strategy that matches the characteristics of those groups and to see, okay, what is really needed from the outside on a national level and what is really needed at a personal level. The same we did, we tried to replicate it for the flood affected areas. And we thought, okay, how can we use serious games to facilitate this collaborative learning process? So what can I learn on my own? And what do I need help with from the others that surround me? And we saw again that there was a presence of certain groups that were more present than others. And we saw also again that a lot of people were very motivated to build back safer. So the motivation was not really an issue. But we saw the diversity in the abilities in this case, with certain abilities that people had. I'm going to skip this one. So we are co-designing those games. So as an outsider, it's difficult to design a game that fits the context of Nepal. But with local stakeholders, we can facilitate this co-learning process. So we work with different groups inside and outside Nepal to optimize the playability of the game. Tomorrow in a guest lecture in University of Salford, I will dive into this more. But this is just to give you an understanding that there's many aspects to developing such a game. And eventually, we look at the contextualization, the educational design of the game, the game mechanics, the playability, does it really work? And that game, well, now looks like this, the flood resilient housing game, but we are further developing in this in the future. Okay, so we already discussed safety is an outcome we can look at, but a safe house is not always important. There might be other things that are more important in people's lives. So we want to understand, if we give assistance, what is the wider impact and what is the desirable impact we want to make. And it is best if we don't come from the Netherlands or the UK and come in with our ideas or what is good for them. Because maybe finding back their dog in Porto Alegre is more important than other aspects. So it's good to understand what is really helping people to enhance their resilience. So what we try to do is look in time using the livelihood dynamics. How does the livelihood of people change over time? So both the physical aspects, the housing related aspects, the financial aspect, the social, the natural and human. So we can measure different types of assets that people have and how that changes over time. And we then look at, okay, what is the impact of housing related assistance on these other livelihood aspects, and to look at those relationships in the reconstruction process. So there is something definitely that we can learn from literature, but as Sarah already explained, there are many gaps there. So we also need a better understanding from the field, and we're now currently doing a longitudinal study to look at those changes, measuring the livelihood dynamics and this decision-making process, and see how these two interrelate and build different models that simulate the way we then can also help. Feel free to share other ideas if you have them that can inform a better understanding of this process. To wrap it up, what I hope we understood today is that we need to have a better understanding of decision-making processes to be able to adapt assistance to that for different types of disaster, and also looking at different types of desirable outcomes. This was really in a nutshell what I'm working on, but I'm happy to discuss it further also in the upcoming days that I'm still here in Loughborough, and also happy to answer all of your questions that you have here or also online. Okay, thank you very much.